This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for an MTG Top 10. Last week, I officially went from doing one of these a week on Fridays to doing an MTG Top 10 every Wednesday and Friday as a result of going full-time on content creation for the summer. There is a benefit to doing two of these a week, and that is that I can do two MTG Top 10s in a week that are related to one another, that tell sort of different parts of the same story, and that's what I'm doing this week. In these two top 10s, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different than I usually do. Most of the time, these look at individual cards in some particular category and then rank them based on their performance at Magic's highest level tournaments. In both of this week's MTG top 10s, I'm looking at entire mechanics. I'm still using objective data to rank them, but instead of just looking at one card, I'm looking at mechanics collectively. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the 10 mechanics in Magic history that have had the worst performance at the game's highest level, and on Friday, I'll talk about the best ones. The methodology for these videos is similar, but has a little bit more going on than usual. I'll be using my usual point system to assign points to cards, which means Pro Tour, Legacy, and Vintage Championship top 8s, as well as Mythic Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and Grand Prix top 8s are worth 1 point. But because I'm looking at all the cards in a particular mechanic, there is more to talk about. For each mechanic, I used 4 different measurements to come to a conclusion about how good they are. I looked at the total number of cards printed with each mechanic, the percentage of those cards with 1 or more point using my scoring system, the total of points for each mechanic, and finally, the points per card for each mechanic. Collectively, these statistics will allow me to rank the worst and best mechanics in the game. These statistics mean that if several cards with a particular mechanic have seen play, or if just a few cards, or maybe even a single card has seen a ton of play, that can keep a mechanic from making this list, and I think that's the way it should be. If several cards from a mechanic have seen play, or one card has been really successful, obviously it's not one of the worst mechanics of all time. So for a mechanic to find itself here, it has to have never had any sort of sustained success at a high level, collectively, or on a single card. There were some requirements that a mechanic had to meet to be eligible for inclusion on this list. First, the mechanic had to be around by the end of 2017. I didn't think it would be fair to include newer mechanics because they are at a huge disadvantage here, simply not having as much time to see play. Additionally, a mechanic has to appear on 10 or more cards to be eligible. This means that some mechanics that are widely considered horrible, like Sweep and Epic, aren't eligible for this list. My reasoning here is, again, that they are at a considerable disadvantage, since if a mechanic barely appears on any cards, it's difficult to judge whether that mechanic is bad or just hasn't been given a fair shake. Additionally, if a mechanic had cards that were heavily played in EDH, I also chose to throw it out, because being played a ton in EDH sort of disqualifies a mechanic from being one of the worst ever. The 2 mechanics I excluded under these terms were Chroma and Conspire, which didn't fare well at the highest level, but have cards that are played a lot in EDH. If a mechanic is truly horrible, it won't see much play in EDH either. Finally, a mechanic had to appear in a standard legal set, so mechanics exclusive to sets like Conspiracy aren't eligible. So in all, there are 115 mechanics that were eligible for this list. Let's see what 10 were the worst. At number 10, I have Bolster, which showed up in Fate Reforged. The mechanic was pretty heavily supported in Fate Reforged and Dragons of Tarkir. It was the green-white mechanic. Despite getting 23 cards, only one of them saw any play, and that's Anafenza the Kintree Spirit. So what held this mechanic back? Well, the fact that you don't really get to choose where you put the +1/+1 counters makes it a pretty powered-down version of this type of effect. This ability is keyworded and is basically a powered-down version of any other card that lets you choose where to put counters, which is not the kind of mechanic to get excited about. I mean, even Dramoka, an efficiently costed dragon who could repeatedly bolster, didn't make a dent on the tournament scene. Something we will see a few times on this list is that the mechanic is costed out of range for competitive Magic, perhaps because R&D found it too powerful when cards with it were cheaper. Cards like Aven Tactician and Dramoka Captain just have horrendous stats, and adding Bolster to them just doesn't make that not matter. At number 9 is Bloodthirst, a mechanic that originally debuted in the original Ravnica block as the Gruul mechanic. It also made a second appearance in Magic 2012. The mechanic rewards you for having done damage to your opponent earlier in the turn by making your creature come into play with some number of +1/+1 counters. In all, 23 cards have been printed with Bloodthirst, but in all, only 2, Scab Clan Mauler and Stormblood Berserker, have seen play at the highest level, and neither of them at a high rate with only 5 points between them. You would think Bloodthirst would be good for an aggressive deck, and that would be true. I mean, that's where the Mauler and Berserker have been played. But the problem is that most of the cards printed with Bloodthirst just aren't aggressively costed enough. Most of them have abysmal stats if you can't get Bloodthirst to trigger. And even when you do, a lot of them are just kind of efficient creatures, and some of them aren't even that, even if you get Bloodthirst going. Cards like Battering Worm and Bloodscale Prowler are good indications of the mechanic at its worst. I think in the future Bloodthirst may have hope of being a better mechanic. It seems like if they could kick up the power level of cards they want to put it on, it would improve enough to get off of a list like this. For now though, it's one of the least successful mechanics in all of Magic, with only 8.6% of the cards with the mechanic having 1 point or more, which averages out to 0.217 points per card with Bloodthirst. At number 8 is Amplify, a mechanic that I think is both uninteresting and underpowered. It appeared in Legions, the second set in Onslaught block back in 2003. Onslaught block was arguably the most tribal block in Magic's history, and Amplify was a mechanic that was meant to be well suited for such an environment, since if you had more creatures in your hand with the same type as the creature with Amplify that you just played, you could reveal them and make your creature bigger. The problem that Amplify has is pretty similar to the problem that Bloodthirst has. The creatures who do have it are horrible if you're not getting the Amplify going, and even if you do, it isn't anything special. Plus, you give valuable information to your opponent, which while not a huge deal, does weigh the mechanic down even more. The other awkward thing about them is most decks that are really aggressive tend to be in top deck mode, and when you draw one of these creatures who has Amplify and you suddenly can't amplify it at all, it's just going to be horrible, which makes it so the cards just aren't going to see play. The one card with Amplify which saw a tiny bit of success is Kilnmouth Dragon, who has 1 Pro Tour top 8 from Onslaught block in a ramp deck that happened to run several dragons. Kilnmouth Dragon not only had Amplify 3, meaning unlike most of the cards with the ability it got 3 +1/+1 counters instead of 1 for each dragon you revealed, but it also had a powerful ability tied to the +1/+1 counters you put on it. The other thing that the dragon has going for it is that dragons get stuck in your hand more frequently. You play them later in the game, so you're not going to be in top deck mode necessarily, meaning that amplifying with it was easier than with some of the other cards. Some bad examples of Amplify are, well, basically all of the rest of them, but if I had to pick 2 exemplars of how bad it was, I would pick Embalm Brawler and Aven Warhawk. The Brawler punishes you for amplifying, and the Warhawk needs a ton of help to be a respectable creature. This is true of the other Amplify cards too. I think there's a reason that, despite the mechanic being 16 years old, and despite the fact that we've had many tribal sets, we've never seen this mechanic return. Like Bloodthirst, I could maybe see some hope for this mechanic in the future, but in general I think a mechanic like this one, that only rewards you if you have creatures of the right creature type in your hand, is a pretty bad design. Next I have Tribute, which is actually our 4th consecutive mechanic that involves +1/+1 counters, interestingly enough. This mechanic is kind of cool flavor-wise. Basically, the creatures with this mechanic demand a tribute for your opponent, and if they don't get it, well, they're going to do something about it. The tribute involves putting +1/+1 counters on your creature, and every creature with tribute does something different if tribute isn't paid. Generally, though, it involves gaining an Enter the Battlefield ability or keyword ability until the end of the turn when you play it. So, what's the problem with this mechanic? Well, like always, cards that let your opponent choose between 2 options are not very good. This is because your opponent can almost always choose an option that makes it so the card doesn't affect them very much, one way or another. Can't take 5 damage from Farragax Giant? That's fine. Let it be a 5/5. Now, it can happen that both options aren't good for your opponent, but the problem is that just doesn't happen very often, and even when that's true, both options aren't going to be equally bad, and it's not always going to be the case that the option is really worth playing the card you're playing, even if one of them is worse for your opponent. The one card with Tribute that saw any play was Fanatic of Xenagos, and that is because both parts of it have a pretty similar goal: attack the opponent to death and do it efficiently. As either a 3-mana 4/4 with Trample or a 3-mana 4/4 with Haste and Trample for a turn before shrinking back to a 3/3, you're getting a good deal, and both attack your opponent on the same axis with the goal of aggroing them out. I think with some creativity, maybe this mechanic could be better in the future, but I have a hard time seeing that. At number 6, I have Inspired, the second Theros block mechanic to make the list. Obviously enough, creatures get tapped and untapped all the time. So having some sort of nice effect to go along with the fact that they untap seems pretty nice, right? Well, maybe it could have been, but most of the 19 cards that were printed with this mechanic are pretty, well, uninspired. The problem with the mechanic is that you need your creature to be able to attack and survive, in most cases to take advantage. Sure, there are other ways to tap and untap stuff, but for the cards to be powerful enough to see play at the highest level, they need to be capable of doing stuff on their own, and none of them really are. Some of them are inefficient creatures like God-Favored General, who would basically never survive a foray into combat without considerable help, or if they did have reasonable stats, they were like a Resco's Sun Guide, whose trigger doesn't do much. The one card from the group to rise above being Draft Chaff was Painseer, who actually had decent stats as a Grizzly Bear and a powerful Inspired trigger that drew you extra cards, but still, he only ever managed a single point, the only point these cards have ever mustered. If they really wanted to make cards with this mechanic more powerful, they would have made the creatures better attackers, at least the ones at higher rarities. At number 5, we have the Dimir keyword from Return to Ravnica, and that's Cypher. It and the mechanics above it on this list have 0% of their cards seeing play, which also means that there's an average of 0 points per card, so the rankings from here on out are based on which of these 5 terrible mechanics have the most cards printed and still have 0 points. Luckily for Cypher, it is the least bad of these 5 mechanics that have had almost no impact on the game because it has the fewest cards. The mechanic was cool in terms of Dimir flavor. You got to cast a spell and then encode it on your creature, and when it did combat damage to a player, you got to cast a spell for free. This is a cool design, but the execution was horrible. I understand that they wanted to make these cards cost a lot of mana to prevent insane stuff from happening, but I think they went a few steps too far. The problem is, the way they costed these cards makes it seem like you'll always be getting the spell twice, but you don't. You're encoding it on a creature, which may not be able to attack on the board state or worse, might get killed. You also have to have a creature in play, which is certainly not always guaranteed. As a result of this, not a single card with Cypher has ever seen play at a competitive level, and they aren't played very much in EDH either. I mean, look at Call of the Nightwing. It makes you a 4-mana, 1/1 flyer, which is horrible. I mean, I get it. The joke here is that you can then encode the creature you made and start churning out a 1/1 every turn. Look out. But a 1/1 is going to be stopped pretty easily, and in the end, you'll have spent 4 mana on it. Then there's something like Last Thoughts, which makes you pay 4 mana to draw a single card. Even if you hit them with an encoded creature, you're not getting a good deal. Once you do it a third time, I guess you're in good shape, but good luck with that. Cypher just seems like it's always going to be a big risk for card disadvantage and inefficiency, and I can't really imagine it ever really rising above being on a list like this. At number 4, we have Rampage. This mechanic punishes your opponent for blocking your creature with more than one creature. Rampage always has a number value, and whatever that value is, that's the stats boost that the creature receives for each blocker beyond the first. How very exciting that isn't, because your opponent is aware that your creature has this ability. It isn't like you're going to sneakily blow your opponent out when they block with 2 creatures. Instead, they just won't block your Craw Giant, which costs a whopping 7 mana for a 6/4. And that's pretty much all he's going to be. It seems that when they designed Rampage, they really thought it was going to be incredibly powerful because the creatures that have it cost several mana more, as if they have Indestructible or Hexproof or something. The worst of the bunch is probably Tika's Dragon, who is laughably a 9 mana 5/5 with Flying and Trample. And yeah, Rampage 4, better look out for that. Basically, this mechanic has an incredibly minimal effect on the game, but it is treated like it's Annihilator or something. It's bad, and that's why none of the 14 cards with Rampage have made an impact on the game, whether you're talking EDH or professional play. At number 3, I have Phasing. Phasing is one of the game's oldest mechanics, appearing in Mirage. If you've watched other MTG top 10s I've done, such as those on various worst cards, or more recently about confusing cards, you know I'm not a fan of Phasing. I think that it is incredibly unintuitive and not the kind of effect that has a payoff that is worth confusing people, especially newer players. Basically, the idea is if you have a permanent with phasing, it phases out during your first upkeep after you control it. While it's phased out, you treat it as if it doesn't exist. It doesn't technically leave the battlefield or anything, it just can't do anything. If it's a creature, it can't attack or block or use activated abilities, and if it's a land, it can't be tapped for mana, and so on. Then, on your next upkeep, anything you have with phasing that is phased out phases back in and is treated normally again. In addition to being complicated, they just didn't design any cards that make interesting use of the mechanic, something that I think has proven to be possible with the more recent printing of Teferi's Protection. Basically, everything that has phasing wasn't given aggressive enough stats or effects that it was worth having to deal with what is usually going to be a downside. Even by the standards of Magic back in the mid-90s, when creatures were generally much weaker than they are now, this mechanic was on weak creatures, and never made its way to the game's highest level as a result. At number 2, we have Solshift. After a couple of old mechanics, we moved to one that is more recent, but it's still pretty old, having made its debut in Champions of Kamigawa back in 2004, but that's almost 10 years more recent than Rampage and Phasing. Anyhow, Solshift was an ability that was supposed to be a tribal payoff for spirits, which there were a lot of in Kamigawa block. In all, 27 cards were printed with this mechanic. Each card with Solshift had a numerical value assigned to it, and when that creature died, you could return a spirit with converted mana cost less than or equal to the Solshift value from your graveyard to your hand. The basic premise here is fine, I think, but as we've seen with some other mechanics to make the list, the execution was terrible. While Solshift is certainly more powerful than something like Rampage, most of the spirits with Solshift are given insanely high converted mana costs, as if the designers were really concerned about it being busted. Now, to be fair to those cautious designers, the block right before Kamigawa was Mirrodin, and they messed up royally on a number of cards in that set, so maybe I shouldn't be so hard on them. But man, this mechanic was not enough of a payoff for a spirit deck to ever be a thing in Kamigawa block or the standard of the time. I mean, sure, your 7-mana 4/4 Vine Kami had Solshift 6, so it was almost definitely going to return a spirit to your hand, but that is way too much mana for such a creature. Look at something like Gravedigger, which is a much older card than Vine Kami, is less restrictive about what it returns, and does it when it enters the battlefield instead of when it dies. Sure, it doesn't have great stats for 4 mana, but a 4-mana 2/2 with that Into the Battlefield ability is miles better than Vine Kami. They did print some cards that had Solshift and Sacrifice abilities, like Pus Kami, and yeah, if you ever actually got to get this thing into play for the million mana it asks for and then kill a creature and get a spirit back, well, you'd be in business, but that's a lot to ask. I also think this mechanic just sort of had a bad parasitic design. It's just too narrow of an ability, even if what you really want to do is push spirits. Spirit Tribal has actually become a thing in the years and years since Kamigawa block, thanks to both of our visits to Innistrad, but it's no surprise that Wizards didn't bring back Solshift to strengthen the creature type. And at number 1, surprising no one, we have Banding. It has firm hold of number 1 by virtue of there being 62 cards with this ability, and none of them ever doing anything in competitive Magic or, for the most part, in EDH. Banding has so many cards because Wizards refused to stop using it after it proved too weak, something they didn't make the mistake with on other cards on this list. Cards with Banding date back to Alpha in 1993, and they kept printing cards with it all the way until 1997. Like Phasing, Banding is a mechanic I have also dumped on a lot over the years. Like Phasing, Banding is an overly complicated mechanic that has very little real impact on the game, and like a lot of these mechanics, creatures who were given Banding are costed like they're incredibly powerful or something, instead of having a near useless keyword ability. So, in a nutshell, this is how banding works. If a creature has banding, it can join up with one other creature to attack as a band. The band can be blocked as if it is only one creature, which is more downside than upside, but the upside of banding comes from the fact that you get to decide how to divide the damage your opponent's creature does. This also works if you block with a creature who has banding. So, what impact does this have on a game? I mean, a little bit of one. It definitely makes combat complicated, and sometimes, sure, you can use banding to really mess your opponent up, but much like Rampage, this keyword ability can mostly be ignored since you know it's coming, you don't have to set yourself up to block a band, and most of the creatures who can attack as a band aren't all that scary to begin with. This gets trickier attacking into things with banding, but it is still something you can prepare for. Then, of course, none of the creatures with banding are any good anyway. Playing a 5-mana 2/4 like Icatian Phalanx isn't even close to worth it thanks to banding. Probably the worst card with banding is Mishra's War Machine, which combines banding with a horrible upkeep effect and horrible stats, as if they thought Mishra's War Machine was going to be too strong with banding. Well, that does it for our discussion of the worst mechanics in Magic's quarter century of history. I'm done dumping on mechanics for now. Are there any mechanics you thought I was unfair to or that you were surprised didn't make the list? Let me know in the comments. On Friday, I'll be back to talk about the flip side of this, the best mechanics in the game using the same methodology I used here. If you want to make sure you catch that MTG Top 10 and other MTG content, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And if you want to see MTG Top 10s from the past, the playlist should be on your screen now. Thanks for watching.